His enemies were close behind. So close that at the wooden bridge they almost caught him. Two supporters told him to carry on and turned to make a stand. They died fighting. Everyone else he passed was urging him on as if he was in a race, but none of them helped him. Gaius's body was discovered in a grove of trees on the southwestern slopes of the Janiculum, a hill west of the river Tiber, beyond the limits of the ancient city of Rome. Just 1 year earlier, Gaius had been perhaps the most powerful man in the known world. He was elected a second time to the office of Tribune of the People. He wielded the immense powers and protections of that office like no other holder of the office in history. He could do so because of his immense popularity among Rome's mass of ordinary citizens, the plebeians. He had made good on his promises as well. As tribune, what Gaius introduced in a series of separate measures was nothing less than an entirely new constitution. A bread doll, land redistribution, diminishing the control of elites over the judiciary. When they found him lying amongst the trees on the hill outside the city that day, there was a bounty on his head. The person who found Gaius was promised his head's weight in gold. Head found, head duly removed. An industrious and unsqueamish fellow, possibly named Septimulius, in order to increase the perquisite of his errand, went on and extracted the brain from the skull of Gaius Gracchus, tribune of Rome, and poured in molten lead instead. Gaius was just 32 years old, and, rather distractingly, he looked rather like one of our own frazzle-eyed populists. The year is 121 BC. The scene is, as you'll have gathered, Rome. The politics are those of the Roman Republic, a system that contained, as Alexander Hamilton was moved to express it in Federalist number 34, two legislatures, one where the elites were dominant, one where the masses were dominant, each, as Hamilton puts it, having power to annul or repeal the acts of the other, coexisted for ages, and the Roman Republic attained to the utmost height of human greatness. Gaius had recently lost an election for a third term in office. One of his greatest enemies and most attentive observers, Consul Lucius Opimius, was freshly instated as head of government. Gaius's enemies, led by Opimius, were making a parade and a performance out of erasing his reforms. The day before Gaius's grisly end, the day when Opimius was intending to repeal Gaius's laws, began with the Capitol being occupied early in the morning by both parties, supporters of Gaius and supporters of Opimius. After the consul, Opimius had performed the sacrificial ritual in front of the temple of Jupiter on Rome's Capitoline Hill, Quintus Antilius, one of his lictors, the retinue of 12 bodyguards provided to every Roman consul while in office, was carrying the entrails away. And he said to some opposing faction, "Make way, scum! Make way for good Romans!" By some accounts, he partnered these ambrosial and judicious remarks with a rude gesture. First, it's important to note that Quintus Antilius wasn't a pirate. Second, you may not be surprised to hear these remarks from Quintus Antilius, whether they were accompanied by a rude gesture or not, were pretty unhelpful in terms of the seething tension going on up there in the capital that day. Anyway, Plutarch continues. Antilius died there and then, stabbed to death with long writing styluses, which are said to have been especially made for the purpose. One man's murder, committed with custom-made writing instruments as the weapons used by the culprits, the mob that did it. This one murder can be seen as sealing the fate of not only Gaius Gracchus, whose headless body was thrown into the river Tiber, along with 3,000 of his male supporters who were executed without trial, their wives forbidden from mourning their husbands. Not only all those people at that singular moment in time, but all those who followed them. In a sense, these transgressions marked the beginning of an incurable chain of events that over the next 94 years would collapse the remarkable, once promising 482-year-old democratic experiment built from shining moments of compromise that was the Roman Republic into a state of permanent dictatorship. A murder that reached every corner of history. A murder in which the weapon was a pen that looked somewhat like this. Welcome back to PandaPenClub, the fountain pen channel where we hunt down and sniff out the most intriguing, delightful and reasonably priced fountain pens on the planet. Most important of all, we seek out pens that inspire us. Today we're reviewing the PenBBS 267, sometimes known as the 267 Longtail. You might liken it to an old school desk pen, but to me, the first thing I thought of when I saw the 267 was something even more old school than that. It was a Roman stylus. A stylus is a writing instrument made out of wood or metal and used in conjunction with tablets or tabulae or pugilares. They were made of wood or sometimes bronze, oblongs covered in wax, cera. The business end of the stylus was sharpened to a point and used to scratch your desired markings into the cera on your tabulae. The other end of the stylus was usually blunt and flat, perhaps circular like the cap here of the 267, and this could be used to rub out so you could start again. Tabulae were used for notes, for jotting, for drafting, for sums, for pondering, accounts and legal documents as well. They were all over the shop in Rome. A lot of people would be carrying these around all over the place all the time. Perhaps not as ubiquitous as bloody telephones, but a comparably ordinary thing to see in daily life. This is strange because the 267 of its very nature and by its very design is not a practical pen. It's 185mm long, capped, and 175mm or thereabouts uncapped. And although it's very light, weighing in at 19.5 grams, and that's capped, and 14.5 grams uncapped, it's not a pen to carry around in your bog standard pencil case. In my review of the Duke 600 and various blobular works of prehistoric art the other day, I made a mistake. Imagine, I said this was the longest pen I own. Well, it's not. This is. By quite a lot too in pen terms. In another nail in the coffin of practicality, the 267 doesn't post. It's a pen that demands a bit of attention, not least from the writer. And if you're really chaotic, it's a pen that could have your eye out. The stylus, as a commonplace accessory in the Roman Republic, was in fact the Republic's ultimate tool of political assassination. Why was this? Apart from the fact it's pointy, which was important too, there was a line, mainly imaginary, which ran around and through the city of Rome. It was called the pomerium. It marked a profound change in the way life was regulated. Soldiers were required to disarm, for example, because everything inside was considered a civic space, ordered by civilian rule and, in theory, civilized conduct. In contrast to everything outside, mere argere or territory, which was potentially less so. So inside this special, civilized space that was Rome, any would-be sicarius or ruffian assassin had to smuggle in a dagger, small enough to hide down their trousers or wherever. But of course, with weapons pretty much banned, a dagger down your trousers raises tricky questions. It suggests a bit of premeditation, not always desirable. So the joy of a stylus was not only that you could carry it around without raising any proverbial eyebrows, but also that it made your mob murder incident look unplanned. When Quintus Antilius was killed in the capital, Opimius, according to Plutarch, reacted as if he'd been given a signal. His mood was exultant. He acted swiftly to implicate Gaius' supporters in Antilius' murder. Who else could it have been? He had the body laid out on a couch with all of its many wounds in plain sight, and then had it laid out in the Forum, Rome's central hub of day-to-day life, with the Roman Senate in attendance. It was a very effective piece of grandstanding. The grisly fate of one man, a single incident, the circumstances of which remained very murky indeed, yet it was swiftly conflated by Opimius with a huge, sprawling and deeply alarming conspiracy of which Gaius Gracchus was the alleged leader, hell-bent on destroying the Republic. The Senate freaked out. A state of emergency was declared, and Opimius was temporarily given the powers of a dictator. The people of Rome, meanwhile, were obliged to take up arms. It was now each and every citizen's duty to harm or kill Gaius Gracchus. It's worth noting at this point that according to the Oxford Latin Dictionary, stylus has the same root as stimulus, stay meaning to prick, and instigo meaning to incite. One of the really minor ways the PenBBS 267 differs from an ancient Roman stylus come assassination weapon is that it's made from acrylic. PenBBS typically release pens in an array of twinkling, glossy, somewhat mesmeric colours. The 267 was initially released in no less than 28 colours. PenBBS usually have fabulous names to go with each fabulous colour scheme. Mine here, the nice people in the PenBBS Facebook group Taste the Rainbow had to remind me, is called nephrite, which refers to one of the two minerals usually called jade. Historically in China, jade has been placed on something of a pedestal, probably made of jade. It was also known as the imperial gem. China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, had the ancestral seal of the realm carved from a famed lump of jade and inscribed with the words, "Having received the mandate of heaven, live long and prosper." The emperor's possession of the jade seal symbolised their authority. So we have a jade pen, the substance of dictatorial power in China, in the shape of a stylus, the weapon that sped the Roman Republic towards its own emperors. Coincidence? Over 1,000 years ago, the imperial jade seal was lost, but the Chinese emperor's authority persisted. This speaks to the arbitrary nature of power.
From now on, all remaining agents and trainees will be known as James Bond 007, including the girls.
Well, that'd be rather confusing, sir.
Exactly.
The arbitrary nature of inheriting anything, the arbitrary nature of most of life.
That's the kind of remark that leads to war.
This white-knuckled relationship with power was something Gaius should perhaps have not found terribly surprising. After all, he wasn't the first in his family to suffer a brutal fate at the hands of Rome's ruling elite and their delightful representatives in the Senate. His brother, Tiberius Gracchus, 9 years older than Gaius, had also been a groundbreaking populist tribune of the people. Would you believe it? Elected in 133 BC, Tiberius had also marshalled the fervour of the masses to implement reform. And then when it became clear he intended to run for a second term and cause yet more strife to the pocketbooks of the wealthy classes, he was beaten to death with pieces of broken up furniture by an angry mob. This was pretty much the first act of political violence in Rome since the founding of the Republic almost 4 centuries before. It marks the moment that the wise principle, we don't actually murder our political enemies, which had proven relatively useful over the years, began to fall into a bit of disrepair. As Laurence Olivier once said to Al Pacino, impersonated by Vinnie Verderci, played by Bill Hader,
"You cannot unbake a cake. You cannot unshake a shake. And you cannot fake the snake."
So both brothers ended up dead. dead adjacently to similar political aspirations and careers that threatened to undermine all the perks that came with being lovely and rich in ancient Rome, and ensured you could probably continue doing so. Their aspiration to benefit the working classes was the fuel and the shtick, in fact, behind their rise to power. Both brothers were populist demagogues. And this is particularly savoury and ironic because Gaius and Tiberius, the Gracchi, men of the people, scourge of the patricians, were in fact wealthy aristocrats themselves. They came from one of Rome's fanciest and most well-heeled families, the Cornelia gens. Their father was a consul, so top of Rome's cursus honorum or greasy pole of politics. Their maternal grandfather, however, was of even more delectable provenance. Scipio Africanus was the general who had defeated Hannibal. Hannibal. You know Hannibal, ruler of Carthage, invaded Italy across the Alps on African war elephants. Yes, that's Hannibal, that one. In 202 BC at the Battle of Zama, which sounds absolutely terrifying, Scipio Africanus had basically written off this shy, retiring, unworrisome bloke Hannibal, and in doing so, well, he had basically saved the entire republic, hadn't he? He'd left its supremacy unchallenged in the Mediterranean region. He'd given Rome the opportunity to become a superpower. So that was Grandad. That made their widowed mother, Cornelia, such a hardcore dripping in diamonds catch of a patrician that she turned down a marriage offer from Ptolemy VIII. Ptolemy the Luxurious, king of Egypt, for crying out loud. Their mother was, by some accounts at least, a bit hard on them both. According to Plutarch, Cornelia often told her sons off for the fact she was known in Rome by the famed name of the general her daughter had married, but not yet as mother to the Gracchi. This complaint was made to both sons when Gaius would have been about 9 years old. Can you imagine bellowing that at a 9-year-old? These expectations of greatness may account for the gung-ho zero-sum, at all costs ascent to the summit of everything, which both brothers were clearly intent on attempting. Populism has been called a pathology, a style, a syndrome, and a doctrine. Analyses of the conduct of populist leaders often detect the dark triad of socially malevolent personality traits popping up again and again, namely narcissism, which is ego reinforcement and attention seeking, psychopathy, which is lack of remorse, lack of sensitivity, and Machiavellianism, which is manipulative and strategic behaviours, cunning, bastard behaviours, basically. Add to a personality like that the taste of success and access to adulation on tap. You can imagine a populist leader riding a wave could get a very distorted sense of their own superlative brilliance. They often overestimate their own vital role as the miracle X factor in the equation. The same as your common or garden demagogue will tend to see their name written in the stars. I'm going to take opportunistic and cunning heed of the opportunity to segue into the PenBBS writing sample before the end of the review. How subversive is that? Let me say this up front. The 267 writes beautifully. There's good ink flow, and the nib writes smoothly. My nib is PenBBS's standard fancy fine, which is the same you'll find across all of their pens. The section is a nice size. It has these little window ledges at the bottom to stop your fingers flinging themselves to their ruin on the nib below. Lurching up to the other end of the section, the threads are really tiny, and these speak to the overall build quality of the pen. They squeeze tight and encourage you to stop turning rather than leading you to some worrisome jonking halt. Now, for our weirdo personal ad stroke PandaPenClub from the deepest depths of darkest Murgatroyd. Lucky. Panda. Seeks. Jinxed. Zebra. For quick game of whist. There's remarkably little to say when one encounters simple, straightforward, to the point quality. The caliber of the PenBBS 267 is just decisively good in that way, which leads me craftily back into the tale of Gaius and the way all he and his supporters had hoped for was left stumped by the decisiveness of sharp styluses, specially made for the purpose. Gaius Gracchus was a master of the premier communication tool of his day, public oratory. Populist leaders usually have a talent for conjuring a direct portal of connection with their followers, and they tend to have a knack for using their skills to echo and amplify pre-existing discontent. So translating people's grievances into themes and symbols and stories that are disruptive to the existing order. This allows them to mobilize a very large number of people, and to do so at a fever pitch that is very different from normal civic engagement. When I was growing up, my mental image of civic engagement, which I didn't call civic engagement, but my mental image of that concept was kind of like a group of grandmothers repurposing their Thursday coffee morning to stuff boring pamphlets into envelopes for that nice politician who cut the ribbon on the village hall 12 years ago. This is not what a populist supporters are going to look like. Populist leaders, like Gaius Gracchus, are generally known for spectacle. They are provocateurish. They tend to revel, often in apparently childlike ways, in taboo-breaching behaviour. The political theorist Benjamin Arditi calls them drunken dinner guests. Because disruption of the existing order and two fingers up to whoever represents it in the minds of their supporters is where they draw their power from. When you gave a speech in ancient Rome, you'd be speaking to the comitium, a big public meeting space, and you'd be speaking from the rostra, a large platform. Traditionally, you'd face to the right, and you'd be looking towards the curia, which is the Senate house. When Gaius spoke, he turned to face the rest of the forum. He turned to the left. The forum was symbolic of the masses. Boom! For populists, defiance and pettiness can be translated into raw power. This worked in the Roman Republic because the Republic was desperately divided. For years, the rich had been getting richer, the poor had been getting poorer, and the rich, represented by the Senate, had little or no immediate individual interest in acknowledging this. The Roman Republic had gone on something of an expansionist bender over the preceding centuries. First, it came to dominate the other 150 or so city-states on the Italian peninsula. Italians from these other parts of Italy were granted far fewer rights than the cives Romani, the Roman citizens. With Italy subdued, the campaigning spread further afield. Small-holding Roman citizens, the backbone of the army, tended to lose their connection to their land as they were called to fight in more and more far-flung campaigns. In swept the elites, hoovering up the land. Smallholders became fewer and further between, and the latifunda, massive agricultural hoardings or estates, became symbols of the huge divide between entrenched wealth and the ordinary people. The problem was compounded by slave labour, which flooded in from Rome's new territories. It became harder and harder for a Roman citizen to find work. So, when Gaius was elected in 123 BC, we have hordes of unemployed Italians pouring into Rome from the countryside to live in disenfranchised fashion in the city of Rome. In the countryside, we have vast estates owned by the wealthy of Rome, which are being worked by slave labour from foreign territories Rome has conquered. When the Republic was founded in 509 BC, after Rome's last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus was thrown under the proverbial bus by Rome's aristocrats, who more or less had all the power after that. The plebeians gradually accrued rights via a series of extraordinary mass strikes, or secessio plebis. The whole population walked out of the city. They actually left as one, and they stayed outside, reminding those delightful elites just how much they depended on the common folk. Because mass walkouts weren't very practical, easy to organise, or desirable for anyone in Rome, the office to which Gaius was elected, Tribune of the People, was created. 10 tribunes were elected each year for a 1-year term, and their job was to look after the interests of the common folk, to protect them. This was good. This helped. This evolution and capacity to change responsibly as society evolved around the institutions was what was promising about Roman democracy for a flicker of a moment. But it couldn't evolve quickly enough to keep up with the pace of social change or the greed of the wealthy. The challenge for all these disenfranchised, desperate and pissed off people lay in the fact that they were so divided and subdivided. The amount of political power they could exert was therefore very limited. Gaius was elected because he provided succinct messages that expressed all the ordinary folks' agitations and frustrations and resentments. A populist leader offers supporters not only the comfort of fellowship, but also the promise of change. They surrender to the message and the magnetism of the leader and the head rush of the cause. As a result, Gaius's popularity looked and felt very different to any other occupant of his office, ever. This gave him great power, and his 2 years in office included vast reforms that tackled part of the heart of the problem in the Republic. This, however, attracted great loathing from his enemies among the ruling classes, the aristocrats, who felt fundamentally threatened by his reforms, in the same way that they gave the disenfranchised hope. The episode that finished off Gaius as a politician, the one that preceded his failure to gain re-election and ultimately his undoing, shows us, however, that what we're dealing with here is not a story of us and them, the thwarted poor and the evil rich. No, it's a story that shows us the true heart of the problem is the fact that any human being can be led by tribalism and empty promises of short-term gain to act and vote and pay out sums of cash against their own interests. Here's what happened. Gaius was elected for a second term, and this time the Senate were better prepared. They enlisted one of his fellow tribunes, a man named Drusus, and together they began to play Gaius at his own game, bidding for the love of the masses. Every time Gaius introduced legislation benefiting the ordinary people, the Senate would reject it. Drusus would introduce the same legislation, but with an even more generous offer to ordinary people. The Senate would endorse that. Gaius therefore began to shed support because he looked impotent. He looked like he couldn't deliver. Possibly in an act of desperation to widen his support base, Gaius then introduced a citizenship bill that would have given the vote to huge masses of people in Rome who came from Rome's allies, the other Italians, from the other city-states across Italy who were not cives Romani. This was an appalling miscalculation. Why? Well, he under or perhaps overestimated his own supporters. Gaius's supporters, the plebeians of Rome, did not want to share the benefits of their citizenship with other Italians, of course. As we all know, Quintus Antilius was stabbed to death in the capital with specially made PenBBS 267 fountain pens which had fallen through a rift in time. Opimius was then named dictator. As Gaius saw his remaining support melting away, he tried to flee. As he did so, he's said by Plutarch to have cursed his supporters in a prayer. Stricken with grief at the turn of events, he fell to his knees and, with hands outstretched towards the goddess, prayed that the Roman people might pay for their ingratitude and treachery with continual slavery. Gaius' spiritual condition towards the end was clearly not in great shape. When it came down to brass tacks, Gaius' supporters revealed themselves as caring about him about as much as he cared about them. Whether Gaius died by murder or suicide, it's hard to say. What proved really damaging about him was not only his populism, the provocations and transgressions his rise had required him to make, but also the way in which the fear caused by his methods among the aristocrats, among the ruling class, led to his vilification, the vilification of his entire issue. Gaius' supporters were terrorized into submission and then ignored. It became impossible for a leader to emerge who would consider addressing the needs of the masses, and therefore the underlying instability in the Roman Republic, which Gaius had exploited to win power in the first place, was never addressed. The elites had made sure they'd be left alone to game the system again and again until the only way for them to maintain their position was by force. In just the same way, the Roman citizens were jealous of their prerogatives and superiority over other Italians migrating into Rome, until the only way to maintain Rome's dominance over them was also by force. The democratic aspirations of the Roman Republic rotted and weakened beyond repair. And as they did so, external forces took advantage. First, the Marsic War between Rome and its Italian allies, particularly the Samnites. The war ended with Roman concessions. Taking advantage of the turmoil, Rome's territory in Asia was attacked by King Mithridates of Pontus, an area along the south shore of the Black Sea. Armies were mobilized under one of the consuls at the time, a blue-eyed, distinctly ruthless fellow named Sulla. 2 civil wars followed, with the Samnites playing a major role in those two. This culminated in 82 BC with Sulla marching into Rome with an army and the loss of 50,000 lives. He was made dictator without limit of time, marking the first time that force had been used to assert power in the history of the Republic. After Sulla, others aspired to the same powers and impunity when faced with the inconvenient challenge of managing interests other than their own. Sulla potuit ego non potero. If Sulla could, why can't I? Asked one aspirant named Pompey. You can't unbake a cake. Rome's rulers couldn't bear to permit incremental, rational, timely, corrective change. They bet on comfort in their own lifetimes over the security of their children and grandchildren. So the masses embraced populist leaders who had all the answers in the language of absolutes. As fuel for their rise, these leaders split apart the norms that glued together the constitution of the Republic. Their conduct ultimately proved to be governed by the same fundamental motives as the entrenched elites. And of course, two can play at that game. The elites, copying these tactics, adopted the same populist messaging and norm-shattering behaviour that had made their opponents a threat. Until the result was not sustainable progress to the benefit of all, or not even to one entire group, just individual leaders conducting themselves as demagogues. After many years of civil war, Rome became a lawless and dangerous place to be, and in 27 BC the Republic collapsed, when the incremental power gains of military leader and despot Octavius, often called Octavian, was proclaimed Imperator Caesar Divi Filius Augustus, so maybe Great Emperor, Divine Son and Sacred Majesty. Great. Octavius turned the Republic, for all intents and purposes, into an autocratic monarchy. The symptom of unrest became its final cure. Perhaps everything we need to know about the preservation of democracy can be learned by contemplating our stylus-shaped Pen of the day. Saepe stylum vertas. Literally means turn the stylus often. You turn the pointed, sharpened end you write with so you can use the blunt, circular end to rub out the words you've written on your wax tablet. So, correct thyself frequently. Correct thyself in all regards frequently. Or face a much bigger reckoning somewhere down the line. The PenBBS 267, while it lacks the innovation of an eraser itself, it's pretty fabulous nonetheless. It's striking. There are a few new pens out there quite like it. It writes beautifully, and its size demands you sit down with a bit of purpose, and failing that, a bit of pause for thought. If you enjoyed watching this review, well, firstly, thank you. Secondly, don't forget to like, comment, and why not subscribe to PandaPenClub on youtube.com. If you really enjoyed yourself, feel free to share on social media and encourage your friends and supporters to give us a look too. I hope you have a wonderful day.